At just 22, Caitlin had already grown used to carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. A full-time nursing student in Chicago, she juggled early morning lectures and late-night shifts at a quiet little diner called Maple and Vine. Life hadn't been easy, not since her father passed away and her younger brother, Jamie, was diagnosed with a serious heart condition. Every paycheck went straight to tuition, rent, and Jamie's mounting medical bills. That Thursday afternoon, the wind off Lake Michigan was sharp, and Caitlin's shoes were soaked from slush. She had just finished a grueling anatomy exam and was running on little more than coffee and worry. With 30 minutes to spare before her evening shift, she slipped into a booth by the window and stared at the menu, not because she couldn't decide what to eat, but because she had exactly $12 left to her name. Enough for a warm bowl of soup and maybe a cup of coffee. A small reward, she thought. A quiet moment to breathe. She had no idea that within the hour, that same small act of self-care would lead her into something far bigger than she could ever imagine. Just as Caitlin was about to call over Waitress, the door to Maple and Vine swung open with a jingle of bells and a burst of cold air. A hush fell over the room, not the respectful kind, but the uneasy silence that follows something unexpected. An elderly man stood in the doorway, hunched against the wind, his coat threadbare and heavy with grime. His shoes were two mismatched pairs of sneakers, duct-taped around the soles. His white beard was tangled and uneven, and his eyes, those hollow, tired eyes, scanned the room like he wasn't quite sure where he was, or why. A young couple near the bar whispered and pulled their drinks closer. One of the waiters frowned and stepped behind the counter, discreetly reaching for the phone, probably to call security. A manager peeked from the kitchen, then quickly disappeared. But Caitlin didn't move. She watched the man shuffle forward, his steps slow and uncertain, like each one took effort. He paused in the middle of the dining room, blinking at the lights, at the people, at the warmth he hadn't felt in who knows how long. There was a kind of lostness in him that tugged at something deep inside her. Not pity, but recognition. He looked hungry. Not just for food, but for dignity. For acknowledgement. For someone, anyone, to see him. And Caitlin did. Without hesitation, Caitlin slid out of her booth and walked toward the man. She approached him slowly, gently, like one might approach someone waking from a bad dream. "Would you like to sit down?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. The man blinked at her, surprised. He nodded, barely. She guided him to her booth and helped him ease into the seat, then raised her hand to get a waitress's attention. "Could we get a hot meal over here, please?" she asked, reaching for her wallet. Across the room, eyes rolled. A few diners exchanged smirks. From behind the counter, a young waitress named Lana leaned over and whispered loudly enough for others to hear, "You planning on feeding the whole city now?" Laughter followed, mean, quiet laughter. Caitlin heard it, felt the burn of it in her cheeks. But she didn't flinch. She handed over the $12 she'd been saving for herself and ordered the man a full dinner, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and a bowl of chicken soup. Nothing fancy, but warm. Nourishing. Real. "I just think," Caitlin said calmly, turning to Lana, "if you're in a position to help someone, you should." The man hadn't said much. Just a quiet thank you under his breath. But the way he clutched the warm mug of tea the waitress brought over, like it was the first kindness he'd been shown in weeks, that said more than words ever could. And Caitlin? She simply returned to her seat, sipping tap water while he ate. The man had just finished his last bite when the kitchen doors swung open with a clang, and out stepped Ryan Mercer, the owner of Maple and Vine. At 34, Ryan was known for running a tight ship. He rarely stepped out of the kitchen during rush hours, but the murmurs and hushed laughter had drawn his attention. His eyes swept across the dining room, settling on the booth in the corner, the one where Caitlin sat beside the old man. And then, for a moment, everything stopped. The plate in Ryan's hands clattered to the floor. "Dad," he whispered. The word was so soft, so full of disbelief, that it barely carried. But it was enough. The elderly man froze, his hand still clutching the spoon. Slowly he looked up, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, hesitation, and then warmth. "Ryan," he murmured, his voice cracking like an old radio tuning back to life. Ryan rushed to him, knees nearly buckling as he dropped to the floor beside the booth. He reached for the man's hands, then wrapped his arms around him tightly, like he couldn't believe he was real. The room fell silent. For 3 weeks, Walter Mercer had been missing. Diagnosed with early-onset dementia, he had wandered away from his care home on a cold February morning. Ryan had filed a police report, printed missing posters, even hired a private investigator. Nothing. No leads. Until now. The man everyone had dismissed as a vagrant was his father. And the girl who had fed him? The only person who had truly seen him? She had brought him home. After the initial shock had settled and Walter was safely resting in a quiet corner with a blanket draped over his shoulders, Ryan turned to Caitlin. His face was still pale, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from overwhelming emotion. He asked her gently, almost hesitantly, if she would join him in his office for a moment. Caitlin followed him, unsure of what to expect. The small office behind the kitchen was warm, cluttered with invoices and old family photos. One of them, faded and slightly bent, was of Ryan and his father fishing on a lake years ago. Her eyes lingered on it as she sat down. "Can I ask you something?" Ryan began, his voice soft. "Why did you help him? You didn't know who he was." Caitlin hesitated, then nodded. "I didn't need to know. I just saw someone who needed kindness." Something in her tone, matter-of-fact yet sincere, struck a chord deep within Ryan. He asked about her life, and for the first time that day, Caitlin opened up. She spoke of her late father, her mother working double shifts, her little brother Jamie and his weak heart, her nursing school classes, the never-ending bills. She spoke quietly, not seeking pity, just answering the question. Ryan listened without interrupting. His eyes welled with tears. "You remind me of my mom," he said finally. "She was all heart too." He stood, opened the desk drawer, and pulled out an envelope. Inside was $1,500 in crisp bills. He handed it to her, closing her hand around it before she could protest. "I know this doesn't fix everything," he said. "But you changed my life today. Let me help you, even just a little." Caitlin stared at the money, stunned. Her lips parted, but the words didn't come. Only tears. "And one more thing," Ryan added, clearing his throat. "I'd like to offer you a job, something more meaningful. Would you consider becoming my dad's caregiver? You'd be paid well, and we'd work around your school schedule." In that moment, Caitlin's world began to shift. Not because of the money or the offer, but because someone had seen her, too. Caitlin accepted the offer without hesitation. It wasn't just the better pay or flexible hours. It was the feeling that, for once, she could give something back in a way that truly mattered. And so she returned each morning to Ryan's quiet townhouse on the north side of Chicago, where Walter now lived in a sunlit back room filled with old jazz records, potted plants, and framed memories. She approached every day with gentle resolve, reading to him from old newspapers, helping him with puzzles, walking with him slowly through the park, arm in arm. She learned his rhythms, the way his mind sometimes drifted and returned like a tide. She never rushed him, never raised her voice. Just listened. Just stayed. And Walter responded. In time, the fog in his eyes began to lift. He started remembering small things, his childhood dog's name, a favorite fishing spot, the exact way he liked his eggs in the morning. He laughed more. Even joked. Sometimes he'd sit back in his chair, glance toward the kitchen and say, "That girl, she's got sunshine in her." Ryan watched quietly from the hallway, often unnoticed. He saw his father's joy returning, and with it, his own. But more than that, he saw Caitlin, really saw her. Her strength, her patience, the calm she carried even when the days were hard. And day by day, admiration turned into something deeper. something he hadn't expected. The days turned into weeks, and Caitlin became more than just a caregiver. She became a presence in the home, a source of calm that seemed to settle not only Walter, but Ryan too. At first, their conversations were brief, quick updates on his father's meals or medication. But slowly, those updates stretched into stories, shared over cups of evening tea in the kitchen, long after Walter had gone to bed. Ryan found himself looking forward to those moments. He learned that Caitlin had lost her mother when she was just 16, and that the loss had left a silence in her house that never quite went away. She spoke about her brother, Jamie, with fierce love and protective pride. She admitted once that she sometimes felt like she was running on fumes, but she kept going, because giving up simply wasn't an option. In turn, Ryan opened up about his own mother, the woman who raised him and taught him how to cook, how to love people through food. She had passed away 5 years earlier, and though he never said it directly, Caitlin could tell the grief still lived quietly in the corners of his heart. They talked about lost dreams, hers of becoming a pediatric nurse, his of writing a cookbook dedicated to his mom. The talks were never rushed. Just real. One night, as they sat in the backyard watching the city lights flicker, Ryan turned to her. "You didn't just bring my dad back to me," he said, his voice low. "You made me believe in kindness again." There were no grand gestures. No sweeping declarations. Just two people sitting under the stars, finding safety in each other's presence. A few weeks later, they began seeing each other. Nothing flashy, no labels shouted from rooftops. Just quiet dinners, slow walks, inside jokes and gentle glances. A love that bloomed not out of passion, but out of patience. Out of seeing and being seen. 1 year later, on a golden afternoon in early fall, the backyard behind Maple and Vine was transformed. String lights hung from the trees, swaying gently in the breeze. Mason jars filled with sunflowers lined the tables, and the scent of fresh bread and slow-cooked rosemary chicken drifted through the air. It wasn't extravagant, no tuxedos or towering cakes. Just a simple, heartfelt wedding surrounded by the people who mattered most. Caitlin stood beneath the archway Ryan had built with his own hands, wearing a modest ivory dress passed down from her grandmother. Her mother held back tears beside Jamie, who was now healthier than he'd been in years, thanks in part to the full-ride scholarship Ryan had arranged for him at a private school known for its excellent medical program. Walter, beaming with pride, stood tall beside his son, holding Ryan's arm with a strength no one had thought he'd ever regain. When the vows were said and the kiss sealed the moment, Walter wiped away a tear with the back of his weathered hand. "I never thought I'd live to see something this beautiful," he whispered. After the ceremony, guests gathered around picnic tables for a family-style dinner. Ryan's staff, once skeptical, now smiling and proud, served with joy. Lana, the waitress who had once scoffed, gave Caitlin a warm hug and whispered, "You proved me wrong. And I'm glad." Ryan raised a toast that evening, his voice steady as he looked into Caitlin's eyes. This all started with a plate of food. But it became so much more. It became home. And that night, under the glow of garden lights and the hush of soft music, they danced barefoot on the grass, surrounded by love, laughter, and the quiet knowledge that their lives had been forever changed, not by luck or fate, but by one small defiant act of kindness. The kind that saves someone's father. The kind that builds a family. The kind that lasts. Kindness doesn't always come with a spotlight. It rarely makes headlines or earns applause. Most days, it looks quiet. Ordinary. Like a tired young woman sharing the last of her money with a man no one else would even look at. Caitlin didn't help Walter because she thought someone was watching. She didn't do it to gain favor, recognition, or reward. She did it because it was right. Because something in her heart told her that everyone, no matter how lost, how broken, deserves to be seen. And that simple act, that moment of compassion offered with no strings attached, changed everything. She couldn't have known that the man she fed was the father of her future husband. She couldn't have predicted that her gesture would bring healing to a family, stability to her own, and love she never dared to expect. But that's the quiet miracle of kindness. It ripples outward, reaching places we can't see. This story isn't just about Caitlin, or Walter, or even Ryan. It's about all of us. About the choices we make in the small moments when no one is watching. Because it's in those moments that character is revealed, and lives are rewritten. Kindness doesn't ask for reasons. It doesn't wait for permission. And sometimes when we give it freely, it finds its way back to us in the most beautiful, unexpected ways. Would you have done what Caitlin did? Would you have paused, looked beyond the worn clothes and tired eyes, and seen the human being beneath? Sometimes it takes only one quiet decision, one act of compassion, to change the entire course of a life. And sometimes, when we give without expecting anything in return, the universe answers in ways we never imagined. Maybe you've had a moment like that. Maybe you were the one who helped, or the one who was helped. Either way, we'd love to hear your story. What would you do if kindness knocked on your door and asked for nothing but a seat at your table? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story touched something deep in your heart, if it reminded you that goodness still lives in quiet corners of the world, then we invite you to stay with us. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs hope today. And most of all, subscribe to Justice Reloaded HD, where every story is a reminder that no act of kindness is ever too small and compassion always finds a way.